Beruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Nun Tes Amud Beis, starting with Nun Tes Amud Aleph, 6 lines from the bottom. Our Mishnah takes a slight detour from our subject of Eruv Techumi and discusses Eruv Chatzeros. And it talks about when a person wants to make an Eruv throughout the entire city. Well, if it's an Ir Shel Yachid, there's no problem whatsoever, no concern whatsoever. And therefore, they can go ahead and ma'ariv the entire city and carry freely throughout. However, if it's an Ir Shel Rabim, or even if it was an Ir Shel Rabim that was then sold as an Ir Shel Yachid, nonetheless, the Chachamim were concerned that even if you were to make the proper Shitufe Mevuos throughout the entire city, a person might make a mistake and think you can go ahead and also carry in a Rishus Harabim. So therefore, they said that in order to then enable a person to carry in one city, make an Eruv in one city, he has to Meshayer. He has to leave a certain area of the city independent from this area. Now the Gemara brings the following brisa. Tonu Rabbanan. Ir Shel Yachid v'na'asi Shel Rabim. If it's an Ir Shel Yachid that became an Ir Shel Rabim, the Hainu, that there still is a connection to the Yachid who owned the city before he sold to the Rabim. For example, he still collects taxes from the Rabim, and therefore it has the status also of a Ir Shel Yachid. However, the Brisa says you have a Rishus HaRabim that goes throughout the city. How would you go ahead and ma'aber? Says the Brisa, you can make a lechi on both sides of the entranceway, or a kara mikan, or a kara, a cross beam on the top of each entrance, and then you go ahead and carry in the middle. The Brisa continues, however, you cannot make two different you can't go ahead and only make an Eruv on half the city without making an Eruv on the other half the city. You have to do it all together, since it's considered to be one mavui, it's one connected area. Therefore, you're not allowed to then go ahead and only then ma'arev half of it. Or be ma'arev the entire city, or each mavui on its own. The Brisa continues, Haisa shel rabim v'harehu shel rabim. If it was a Ir Shel Rabim and it remains an Ir Shel Rabim, on top of Nun Tes Amud Beis, ve'ein la ela Pesach echad, and it only has one entranceway. In other words, the road that is going inside of the city goes into a dead end. It's only open on one end. So therefore it doesn't have the properties of a Rishus HaRabim. The Brisa continues, Ma'arvin es kula. You can go ahead and ma'arv the entire thing. Ask the Gemara, Man Tana de Ma'arva Rishus HaRabim. Who is the Tana that holds you can make an Eruv if the Rishus HaRabim? Says the Gemara, Rabbi Chuna Bereid Rabbi Yehoshua, Rabbi Yehuda. This is the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda. The Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda says, yes, sir, okay. Now, Rabbi Yehuda is talking about over there that when there is, let's say, two walls in the Rishus HaRabim with on top a ceiling, then you can go ahead and carry within that area. That's considered to be significant because it no longer has the status of a Rishus HaRabim, since you have the two walls. Now, in the Brisa, he says, not only that, but moreover, Rabbi Yehuda, Misha yesh lo shnei batim, somebody who has two houses, bishnei tzidei Rishus HaRabim. You have a Rishus HaRabim, and that's going across, and you have a house on both sides of the Rishus HaRabim. So each house forms a wall. So really, there's an area that has two walls in it. So then the Brisa says, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you can make a lechi on the entrance on one house, on either side of one house, or you make a kara, a crossbeam on both sides, both in front of both houses. So we see from over here that the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda is that again, two walls is sufficient to then take it out of its status as Rishus HaRabim, whereby you can go ahead and metaltel within it. So that's the shita over here as well. Here we're talking about being ma'arev the Reshus HaRabim. And you can do so with the Kara Mikan and the Lechem Mikan. Omar Mar, the Gemara now brings back the previous statement. Ein ma'arvin oisol lechatzoin. We made a statement that you cannot make an eruv for half the city, but not for the other half the city. Omra pope loy omru elo le'arko. That's only talking about when you have the Reshus HaRabim, that you have the thoroughfare going in between, meaning what? La'arka, in the lengthwise. So thereby the houses are facing the thoroughfare. Aval la'arochba ma'arvin. But if you do it the other way, in other words, where the houses are not facing the thoroughfare, then you can indeed go ahead and ma'arev chatzoin and chatzoin. You can make an erev on only half the city. Keman, who does this follow like? Deloi kerabi Akiva. The Gemara points out this is not like the sheet of Rabbi Akiva. Says the Gemara, Di'ik Rabbi Akiva, because if it were like be Rabbi Akiva, now Rabbi Akiva is talking about a scenario when you have two different chatzeros. You have one chatzer, and then you have a outer chatzer, and then you also have a pnimi chatzer. So he says like this: Omar regel hamoteres b'mekayma oiseres afishel mo'mekayma. If an eruv which is muteres in its place, that means the inner chatzer has an eruv for itself. So even though the outer chatzer has an eruv chatzer for its outer chatzer, but nonetheless the inner chatzer that did not mitztaref to make an eruv chatzer with the outer chatzer, that will then oisir the people in the outer chatzer to use that outer chatzer. So again, Ha'omar, he said, regel hamuteres b'mekayma, oiseres shelo b'mekayma. Again, that regel that is muteres in its place, referring to the inner chatzer, because they made an eruv chatzeros, will then be oiser the outer chatzer, even though the outer chatzer, in terms of their own chatzer, made an eruv. But since the inner one did not join with the outer one, it's going to be oiser. Says the Gemara, and therefore that would be also like this opinion as well, because we're going to say this also cannot be like the Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva would say even if you have a thoroughfare that is barachva, so then that also cannot be then lechatzoin. You should say one should oiser the other one. Says the Gemara, afil dem Rabbi Akiva. No, you can say Rabbi Akiva as well over here. Because why? Ad kan like Rabbi Akiva hasam ela b'shtei chatzeros zulifin mizu. Because one chatzer then is going to then be within the other chatzer. That means the inner chatzer has to then go through the outer chatzer to get to the Reshus HaRabim. The pnimi is less le pischa achrina. He has no other way to then get to the Reshus HaRabim other than going through the outer chotzer. So then he can oiser the outer chotzer. Aval hacha, but over here, hani nafki behai pischa, v'hani nafki behai pischa. These can go out from this Pesach, and these can go with the other Pesach. They're not going to infringe on the other ones. And therefore, therefore, even Rabbi Akiva could agree that if it's berachba, then it's going to then be mutter. There's another version. There are those that say, Omra pabaloi teima la'arka, hu deloy ma'arvin, aval rachva ma'arvin. Don't say that the la'arka you can't, but the rachva you can't. No, even but rachva you can't. Ela afilu la'rachva nami la'arvin. You cannot make an eruv not la'arka when the Reshus HaRabim, the public thoroughfare is going la'arka, where the houses are facing that Reshus HaRabim, that public thoroughfare, and not the rachba, even if it's going to be splitting the other way. So Kiman asked the Gemara, who is this light that says that it's not going to be valid, not the arka, not the rachba? Rabbi Akiva. This seems to go like Shittas Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara says, no, afilu teim Rabbanon. Even the Rabbanon could agree. Why? Because ad kan lo kamrei Rabbanon hasam elo b'shtei chatzei zu lifnei mizu. They only said their din over there in the case of the two chatzeros. Why? The pnimis achda ledosha, because the inner, we can force the inner one to close its gates, umishtamsha, to use it on its own, and therefore not to infringe on the outer one. and therefore they don't oyser the outer one. But over here, can you prevent them from using the Rishus Harabim, the public thoroughfare? And therefore, even the Rabbanan can agree, bein la'arka, bein la'rochba, it would be osir. Omar Mark, the Gemara brings back a previous statement. Oy kula, oy mavui, mavui fnei atzma. We said in the Brisa, you cannot make lechatzon, you cannot make half the ear into ma'arev, to make an eruv, but the other half not. What you have to do is either the entire city, oy mavui, mavui fnei atzma. Ask the Gemara, my shno, the lechatzoin deloi. What was the reason why we said you cannot make it lechatzoin only a half? Because the asri adodi, they would asr on each other. So ask the Gemara, mavui nami asri adodi. Even by making each one's own mavui, that should also asr on the other one, and therefore should be equally problematic. Answers the Gemara, hacha b'may askinon kigoin the avud daka. We're talking about a case where he made a small entranceway. The Omar Rav Idi bar Avin Rav Chizda, and like Rav Idi bar Avin said the name Rav Chizda, Echad mibnei mavui she'osa daka lepisroi. Somebody in his mavui who makes a small entranceway in his Pesach, Einoi oiser al bnei mavui, does not oiser on the other bnei mavui. So there you see that over here, this additional point where he makes a small entranceway in each mavui, that will be sufficient to not aser on each other. The Gemara now quotes the Mishnah, Haisa shel rabim v'harehi v'chule. Quotes the Brisa rather. The Brisa says if it was a ear that was shel rabim and remains an ear shel rabim, only the Brisa had stated that if it's going to have one Pesach, then you could go ahead and ma'ariv es kula. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Zera arvo lemato, the Bei Rabbi Chia. The Gemara brings the following. Rabbi Zera, he made an eruv in the city of the place where Rabbi Chia resided once upon a time. V'lo shovak la shiur. So here we're talking about a city of the Bnei, of where Bei Rabbi Chia was, and that city was a Yir Shel Rabim. So our Mishnah, we learned that if it's an Ir Shel Rabim, even if it was end up being an Ir Shel Rabim that was ultimately sold to Yachid, it must be Meshayer a Shiur, a small part of the city that is not included in the overall Eruv. Again, the reason being because they were concerned, the Chachamim, that if we would allow to be Ma'ariv the entire city, one might make a mistake and think they can carry in the Rishus HaRabim. So therefore, by being Meshayer an area aside from the rest of the city, that will be a heker enough for people to know that they're carrying only because of the heter of the Eruv. So he says over here that Rabbi Zera, he then made an Eruv in the entire city, which was a Eruv of a city Shel Rabim, but he was not Meshaya a Shiur. Omar le Abaye said to Rabbi Zera, my time of in Marhochi. He asked him why he did this without making a Shiur, why not leaving an area? Omar le, he said to him, the elders of the city had said to me, Rav Chia bar Asi ma'arev kula. Rav Chia bar Asi, he made an eruv throughout the entire city. Va'amina, and I said to myself, Shma mina, Ir shel yachid v'na'asel shel rabim hi. This is an Ir shel yachid that became a rabim, and therefore, since it originally was an Ir shel yachid, that now is rabim, has the still shame as an yachid, whereby you're allowed to then make an eruv on the whole thing. After all, we learned in the Mishnah that not only in the Ir Shel Yachid, but even in the Ir Shel Yachid that is sold to the Rabbim, becomes an Ir Shel Rabbim, so long as it has some sort of shame as a Yachid, because the Yachid, for example, is collecting taxes, or maybe he owns a significant part of the city still has the shame of the Yachid, whereby the Chacham said you can go ahead and ma'ariv the entire city. So that was Reb Zera's rationale. Since the elderlies had told him that indeed that Reb Chia made an entire Eruv throughout the entire city, then he deduced from that it was an Ir Shel Yachid, that then became an Ir Shel Rabim. Abaye then said to Rabbi Zera, Lididi Amru li Hanu Sabi. To me, the elderlies of the city said to me, Hahi Ashba Havole Mechad Gisa. They said to me that the reason, they told me that there was an Ashba, of which was asar tzvachim high, that was on one side, meaning it closed the entrance. That means there was only really one Pesach, one entrance. And therefore, that's why Reb Chia was able to then make an Erev on the entire thing. V'hashid the ifnei lo ashpa, but now that they had removed the ashpa, it no longer is closing up that second entrance. It's left with now a city that is two psochim and is osir. In other words, you're not allowed to then go ahead and me'arev the entire city. It's an ir shel rabim. And therefore, in ir shel rabim, you have to mishayer shiur. Omar le, Rav Zeir said back to Abaye, lav adaitoi, I didn't know.